Now we have a few more questions about you going from your bachelor's to your PhD. And then to begin with, how has your experience been so far transitioning from going from your bachelor's and then going into as a PhD student?
I think the transition was actually quite jarring. On the one hand, it was exciting because you're entering this new space, and specifically for me, I was moving from one side of the country to the other, to UCT, which is, I mean, everyone knows that it's the best, at least in South Africa, they know it's the best university in South Africa. So that was the exciting bit. The not so exciting bit, and I guess a little bit scary, is that the structure that you have as a postgraduate student is quite minimal. Besides a few courses, you're on your own with the help of your supervisors, and you have to forge your own path. Versus undergrad, where you know exactly what deadline you have at a certain point, what the requirements are for an assessment, and sometimes it's just down to sitting for an exam. But here, yeah, I mean, although you have certain requirements, it's much less structured. And besides that, something which is not often mentioned is that in undergrad, if you're used to working with your colleagues, or even just talking to other people, it's much more difficult to relate to other people once you're in the postgraduate space. You might have similar topics, but very often you find yourself alone in what you're doing, and that part just completely falls away. So you need to be, I'd say you need to be focused, and it's much more difficult to be able to talk to other people to figure out your way.
That's a very nice observation. But could you tell us a little bit about the PhD project that you're working with right now? Like, what are you researching on?
So I'm specifically working on, well, I think I'll mention the title. So the title is Process Technologies for the Recovery of Biobutanol from In situ and Ex situ Separation. And it's got that name because I'm looking specifically at the fermentation of sugar into biobutanol. And biobutanol, well, about 10 years ago or so, was supposed to be, or was claimed to be, the next great biofuel because it could replace the current petrochemical fuels like diesel, jet fuel, or specifically more so gasoline. So there was all the rave about it, and it would be much better than ethanol as a biofuel as well, because you wouldn't need to modify your engines to run with it. So the problem with this process, or the process of making biobutanol, is that it's extremely energy intensive. That's one of the big problems. And you would have to recover it via distillation through the traditional route. So my project was focused on looking at new technologies that would be integrated with the fermentation to draw it out while it is being made. So the idea is that if you do it while it's being drawn out, you will allow the bacteria to continue fermenting the sugars, and that would make the process more efficient in that way. And also, if you have an energy efficient method, it would reduce the overall energy burden of the process. So thereby making it more economically feasible, and also being able to actually use it as a fuel rather than having more energy go into making the fuel.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I hope that sums it up.
Yeah, it does. Yep. So that's quite interesting that you're working on that. But if I was to ask you, how did you get your PhD, the very research topic that you're working with? How did you end up coming across it? Did you apply for it externally, or did you get it through a professor already in your undergrad?
So for myself, I had approached a number of people with interest in the specific topic. So for butanol production, or biobutanol production rather. And after chatting to a few people, a few prospective supervisors, then I landed at UCT under the supervision of Professor Sue Harrison, and there was sufficient scope and interest in the research group. So we took it from there and formalized it into a project. Typically, you have posts which are advertised, and sometimes you are approached by professors to take on a new project. But in this case, yeah, I mean, I ran with something that I was interested in. I approached a few people, and then eventually landed where I currently am with this topic.
Okay, thank you. But if I was to ask you, because for the students out there that are very interested in applying for a PhD later on, what would you say are like the basic requirements in South Africa? For example, if someone was to apply for the very university that you are doing your PhD right now, what are the basic requirements that every student should fulfill before being eligible to apply to be a PhD researcher?
So, should I give the answer as a broad?
Yeah, of course, like a broad general requirements that there are.
Okay, yes. I mean, generally in South Africa, you would need some research experience, and we often take that as a master's. So, the general approach is to apply from your bachelor's to a master's, and then from there, if there is enough scope, it can be upgraded to a PhD. Alternatively, you would do your master's, you'd finish it, and then after that, you would apply for your PhD as well. So, when looking for topics as well, I mentioned there were three ways. You either look for advertisements from your respective universities or the universities you're interested in, or a professor can approach you as well if they see that you're working in a specific space and they could take you on. That's often from working with them or having those conversations with them, whether at a conference or online as well. And then lastly, if somebody was very passionate about projects, they could approach somebody as well. So it doesn't matter which university. It's most people are completely open to things like this, especially passion projects. And if there's funding, then it can be taken from there. So that's the route. I mean, from a bachelor's, you apply for a master's, and even during that application for the master's, you can express interest for a PhD, so that if you want to, you can scope it for a PhD, and at some point you would upgrade it from a master's to PhD.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. But because, like let's say there is an undergrad, you would really have to plan it very early on in your education tenure that you have to go for a PhD, right? Because deciding that you want to go for a PhD in the final semester, that doesn't really give you that much time to prepare yourself. Because normally, many students, they have that option to do research projects with the professors, but what would you suggest for the students? How can they approach professors, and how can they prepare themselves before going for research projects to really brush up their chemical engineering skills, and what skills you keep at the back of the mind?
Okay, so I think just to understand the question, it's about what sort of experience would they be looking at as an undergraduate student, maybe in the third or even in the second year.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, if they're interested in doing a postgraduate degree at that point, I wouldn't say it's necessary, but it would be useful to approach a professor for what we call vacation work in some research topic. And very often these are available. You might not always get what you want, but going into the lab sometimes or working with the data, doing that literature study at that time or literature review would definitely help when you're applying for your master's or your PhD. It will also tell you, whether you actually like to do this. If you don't like to do it, at that point you would know, this is not for you. And if you do like it, then you take it to the next step. Like, what topic are you actually interested in? Is working with this person, is it constructive? Do you like to do it? And that's what I would recommend. So approaching a professor while in an undergrad, whether you're second year or third year, I wouldn't recommend it in first year. And maybe not so in final year as well, because it's extremely intensive. And I think most people will find it difficult to balance the research courses that they have to do as well as the design courses as well. So, I mean, that's my advice.
Okay.
Approach a professor for that experience.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, normally, what I have heard from some different people is that if you're going for a PhD, it's a good idea to do your bachelor's and then do your master's and then get some industrial experience in the middle, just so that you get the industrial practical know-how of engineering, and then go for a PhD, because then you would have the realistic constraints on what you're working with. What has been your take on that? Is it necessary to do industrial work before going for a PhD, or if you go directly for a PhD, is that more beneficial?
So I think there's no one size fits all answer here. In some cases, if you're heavily interested in academia and not so much on the practical side, then it might be better for you to just go from a bachelor's to a master's and then to a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
If you're focused on a topic that is widely used in industry, and you're interested in getting this technology out there or whatever output from your work into the industry as well, then I would recommend going into industry and getting that experience. Whether it's done before or after your postgraduate studies is going to be dependent on what you want out of it. So I think in general, it's much more difficult to leave university than it is to go to the working environment and come back. And it's because again, it's that structure and being in that location again. So focusing on your work rather than clocking off at a certain time if you're having that type of job in industry. So it's a very different mindset. And I would actually recommend if you have a bachelor's and you're interested in doing postgraduate study, go for that master's. If at that point, maybe a year down the line or even 6 months down the line in your master's, you feel that you want to continue this type of work, whether it's in the same topic or not, then you stay on and do the PhD. Otherwise, if you're not feeling it as well as you hoped you would, go to industry. And I say do the master's first because you get that experience of having to work on a topic by yourself. If you go to industry and come back, it's much more difficult. And from the conversations I've had with other colleagues as well who've done the sort of thing, they'll tell you the same thing. It's much more difficult to go from industry back into studying, even if it's a postgraduate study or degree.
Interesting. Yeah, that is a very interesting point. Thank you, Muven.
Thank you for listening. And if you have not done so already, remember to become a free member at Chemical Engineering Life. And do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and stay tuned for more upcoming podcasts with chemical engineers. Thank you and have a great day.